Finally, I'd like to talk to you about some of the key ideas of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander civil rights movement. Firstly, let's make sure we're clear that this is the focus of our unit and not to get confused with the American unit. We're also needing to define who this movement is. The term Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander civil rights movement is kind of a funny use of the word movement, I find at times. It can be individuals, it can be groups, it can be loose coalitions of people. The movement refers to a long and evolving struggle. While it's often used as a movement, like a group, a club, an association of people, it's perhaps also good to imagine the Australian civil rights movement as a movement over time, a movement of change, a shift in position. So, in that sense, the Australian civil rights movement is a reference to a long and evolving struggle, primarily by First Nations peoples, but with some significant allies who are not First Nations, non-Indigenous people. And that struggle has been focused on securing recognition, equality, and justice in Australian society for First Nations peoples. And that sense of recognition, equality, and justice tends to be in a political, legal, and cultural sense. In a way, it's everywhere the civil rights movement is fighting to end discrimination in all aspects of Australian society. But it's probably fair, if I was looking for a definition, to talk about First Nations people are seeking recognition, equality and justice in Australian society. And that recognition is political recognition, political equality, and justice within the political system, the court systems, within land ownership systems and so on, which leads us to think about legal recognition, legal equality in terms of rights that are granted, treatment by police, by others in society, justice, and cultural recognition that First Nations peoples of Australia are an incredibly long and resilient culture that have dealt with a very, very difficult process by which they've been dispossessed during the period of colonisation that continues to this day. The movement, in the sense that I mean a movement, is distinct from the Frontier Wars period of violence. It commences sometime after the 1920s and 30s, where those last wholesale open acts of resistance in warfare ceased. The movement has continued for much of the 20th century, and it continues today, which makes it, again, feeds into this idea that it's a difficult history, it's a hard history, it's a continuing process. This isn't over, it's happening around us now. The movement has transformed from, at times, quite localised acts of resistance into national campaigns. These local acts of resistance might be about access to wages, better conditions, access to buildings and locations. But now we see large national campaigns for self-determination, for voice, for treaty, movements for land rights, land ownership and what that means, and native title. So we can go small, if you like, local acts of resistance as part of our Australian civil rights movement, right through to national campaigns. The movement, broadly speaking, is seeking to overturn a legacy of colonisation after the arrival of the British in 1788. They're seeking redress for the dispossession that took place there. They're seeking to end discrimination. And they have fought against their exclusion from Australian citizenship, which was largely won in 1967. They are fighting and continue to fight and have fought to assert that they are the original custodians of the land on which we stand. And you're used to hearing now, I hope, welcomes to country and acknowledgement of country. It's a representation of achievements of the civil rights movement in Australia. And they want to assert that they are entitled to the rights of Australian citizenship that everybody else who's an Australian citizen should enjoy. And they would point to evidence that historically indicates that that equality, those same rights, that same respect, that same dignity hasn't existed, and to a significant extent may not still exist today. So there are a huge range of conversations in this difficult space that we're likely to have. The key figures. Now, I cannot possibly do justice to every one of these people in a short video like this, but there was a big part of me saying, I want you to be aware of the names, to say the names, to hear the names, that you could look into them further. I'll never do justice to all of them, and I'm aware that when I put this together, how many people I left off. But the leaders of the Australian civil rights movement include elders, and we need to talk in class about who an elder might be, activists, lawyers, community organisers, teachers, doctors, many others, journalists, academics, right? We can name often American civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and so on. But so many Australians don't know the names of our own civil rights leaders. So I'm going to say the names of these for you. I'll say a little bit about some of them, but I am wanting to keep the list short, leaving people out, and I do want to keep the video short for you. So here are some names for you to be aware of. If you were to see these names, you go, civil rights people. So William Cooper, something I'll say about him, spoke up against the Holocaust in the 1930s. Faith Bandler, who actually was an Australian civil rights leader who was not a First Nations person of Australia, but was connected to the South Sea Islander trade, the blackbirding and so on that took place. So deeply involved, richly involved, massive contributions to the Australian civil rights movement, but would never have claimed that she is a First Nations person of Australia herself. Oodgeroo Noonuccal, the poet, formerly known as Kath Walker, from Minjerribah, Stradbroke Island, with massive connections to our community here at All Hallows. Pearl Gibbs, Vincent Lingiari, who many of you will have heard the song From Little Things, Big Things Grow, which unfortunately now has become associated with an insurance ad of all things. But Vincent Lingiari was a Northern Territorian stockman who fought for equal pay. Gary Foley, a famous Queenslander. Jack Payton, Eddie Mabo from Miriam, okay? The island of Miriam people, what used to be called Murray Island, achieved land ownership, proved native title for First Nations people, followed up later by the Wick judgment in the area around Rockhampton. Pat O'Shane, a legal figure. Doug Nichols, Charlie Perkins. And by the way, this is a good time to actually say many of these people are referred to with respect by the title of uncle and auntie. But it's not always universally known who should have it and who isn't. So I'm going with a non-Indigenous approach and naming it the way many textbooks do. But many of these people, absolutely, people like Uncle Charlie Perkins, Uncle Pat O'Shane, okay, Auntie Pearl Gibbs, Auntie Faith, and so on. Louita O'Donoghue, Cheryl Buchanan. These are people located in Australia. Auntie Cheryl has spoken to a number of our students, our First Nation students in our school. They're the names I'd like you to have bubbling away along with others throughout this unit.